A lot of elections over the last 50 years, not as much democracy. And the book tries to explain why, in a world of much better elections, we don't have much better democracies.
Our book argues that elections held in the developing world today don't always go as well as we think they do when they're clean and fair. What's most important isn't a clean and fair election. What's most important is that the political economic context in which the election happens, that is what really dictates the success of democratization after elections. Elections held in what we call hard times, in really difficult contexts, are the ones that go badly.
In many ways, we have set the developing countries that have moved to democratization up for failure. We ask them to hold elections earlier in much harder conditions and under circumstances that make it very hard for the ruling government to do a good job, to actually honor the social contract that is implicit when you have an election. We elect leaders to rule us, and yet in many of the developing countries around the world, they simply don't have the resources to do so. They are doing it in the shadow of violence. They're doing it in extremely constrained fiscal space, and without the institutions that we take for granted in consolidated democracies. So it shouldn't surprise us, in fact, that elections lead to backsliding. They just don't have what it takes to succeed.
What we focus on is what happens after election day. You can have a really great free and fair elections with free political parties, the media covering it, election monitors there, but eventually that attention goes away. And the day after the inauguration of a new prime minister or president, that person has to get to work. And then that begins the hard process of actually governing. And it's that period that we actually concentrate on. When incumbents come to power and they are in a really, really difficult spot. They don't have a reliable bureaucracy or civil service. They have an empty treasury. There's political violence going on in the country. They have very, very little experience governing democratically because perhaps there's never been a smooth democratic transition before this one. They don't have what we call the sort of supporting networks to really govern democratically well. The only way they can win re-election next time is to cheat. They're much more likely in that circumstance to do all the things we don't want them to do, to cheat at the next election, repress political parties, repress dissent, shut down journalists. And when they do those things, that's when the democratic backsliding happens.
In the late 1970s, most developing countries had approximately $1,000 per capita in tax revenues that they could spend. For the developed countries, that was about $3,000. By 2010, the average developed country, rich North American, European country, has about $7,500 that it can spend on its citizens. The average developing country has less than $100 per person to spend. So we have to imagine a world in which governments are being asked to lift citizens out of poverty, build infrastructure on less than $100 a person. We didn't expect that. It was staggering.
The world is getting progressively richer. That's a really, really good story. We want the countries of the world to get richer. But countries holding elections have been getting poorer, which is a very, very odd thing to point out. It's not that democratizing countries are getting poorer over time. It's that the countries that started to have elections have gotten poorer. So 30 years ago, there were several middle-income countries that had never held elections. And then they start to hold elections. The only countries left to start having elections are incredibly poor countries. And so that's a really startling fact that really surprised both of us when we came to that part of the book. The world as a whole is getting richer. Countries holding elections are getting poorer.
We identified three specific sets of criteria. The first is when you have elections in countries that have no prior experience with democracy, almost by definition, the bar is very high and it's going to be very hard. They simply don't have the ancillary institutions, an independent civil society, a judiciary, media, that is required to actually build a successful democracy. The second thing we identify is that when they're held in the shadow of conflict. Over half of all elections held in the developing world today are either happening while there's violent conflict going on or it has just ended. This is a very difficult circumstance. And finally, when elections are held in places where the state does not have the resources to spend on its citizens, nothing good really results from those elections.
We really focus on three in the book. The first is in places with very, very little democratic experience, which is really sad because what it says is that it's hard to gain more democratic experience when you have very little to begin with. So elections held in places with very little democratic experience, with very little what we call fiscal space, so very, very little money for incumbents to spend to actually support the re-election bid by building bridges and clinics. And then finally in places with a recent history of violent political conflict.
Elections have to be seen as the first step in building a state. We think about elections, we think about democracy. I think Tom and I have made an argument here that we're actually talking about building states. We're building countries, we're building nations. And therefore we need to have a very long, patient perspective on democracy building. Elections are exciting, they're important, but they're also one day. And even when they go well, the state has to go back to doing the hard business of governing, and our attention has to stay with that.
It is really easy to focus on election day. We're in the middle of an election in the United States, and it's always really easy to focus on the election itself and on election day itself. But if you're really interested in patterns of democratization around the world, it's not election day you should be focusing on. What you should be focusing on is what happens after election day. The news that sometimes you don't read in the New York Times, not the pictures of people holding up their blue-stained thumbs because they voted. What you need to be focusing on is what happens when incumbents take power, and are we reading stories about incumbents slyly, carefully dismantling democratic reforms after an election takes place. Don't focus on election day, focus on in between elections.